Angie, you got to do some preliminary stuff before we launched Data Security Over Coffee, and I always get grief, Aaron, so thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you
Um,
for having me.
so Data Security Over Coffee for November. First of all, just want to say a huge thank you to Aaron Wisemann for agreeing to be pelted by millions of questions that Angie and I will have for him about something that we think is really cool. Earlier, um, I think one of the things that's most fascinating is trying to take something that can be really dull and boring, an incident response plan, tabletop exercise, and make it really fun. Um, and also, I think Angie and I would both agree that it's also interesting to find another fellow entrepreneur. Somebody, you've got a full-time job, and obviously, that's what helps you take care of your family, right? But when you have that side hustle and you have that entrepreneurial mindset, that's also kind of cool to meet people like that as well. So, um, I guess really where I want to start is just from your perspective, Aaron. What's your day job? Like what do you do Monday through Friday or Monday through Sunday or whatever that work schedule may look like for you?
Yeah, I'm gonna say it's probably closer to Monday through Sunday. I'm on call at all times. So I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Mainline Health. We're a health system in the Philly suburbs, covering most of the Philly suburbs, 5 hospitals, numerous health centers, et cetera. So really trying to preserve the dignity of patients through maintaining data integrity, maintaining data security, and just safeguarding our assets.
Very cool. Um, Anything particular from either childhood experiences or work experiences that led you to the path of information technology, information security? Like, how did you kind of wind up in the space?
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned childhood experiences. I took apart our family computer when I was 6 and couldn't put it back together, right? So we had to take it to CompUSA back when that was a thing, yeah, and,
Yeah.
had to pay them to put the computer back together. The technician showed me exactly what was wrong. It was a hard drive cable, back in the day when, you had the parallel ATA cables and they went in both ways, and if you put it in one way, great, it worked. If you put it in the other way, it didn't, right? So, since then, really enthralled with computers, understanding how they work, understanding, what one can do with them, ultimately led to a career in technology. Yeah, never looked back.
That's interesting. Why would you move into healthcare?
I really like working in healthcare. So I actually started my career in finance. I was an attorney at State Street Bank and Trust Company. Prior to that, I did a small stint as a litigator in civil litigation matters. Found out very quickly litigation wasn't for me. And after a couple of years, decided to move into the public sector. So I worked for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Health and Human Services, where we covered both the payer side and the provider side. So we had a number of different state hospitals, ran Massachusetts Medicaid, had the SNAP program under our, umbrella as well. And, really appreciated the mission of providing for the needy and keeping people healthy and safe. So, really, really loved working at Health and Human Services. Then when I moved into my current job, Mainline Health does a lot of the same things, right? The commitment to the community is extreme. The commitment to diversity, respect, equity, and inclusion is a highlight of the organization and a matter of great pride for the organization. So, I found sort of a kindred spirit job wise in that, and really was drawn to working for an organization that has those kinds of values.
Cool. That's interesting. Um, so I think you'd probably agree that when you take a look at information security and operational IT, um, network infrastructure, et cetera, that they're different domains. I mean, they're related to one another. Obviously, they're directly connected to one another, but they are different. So I'm curious, how did you find yourself in the career position as a CISO? Like, how did you get there?
Yeah. So, like I said, I was an attorney. I was one of two attorneys embedded with the IT department at Health and Human Services, and we provided general advice, for contracting matters, for HIPAA privacy matters, for, you name it. And I sat right next to the CISO's office, so was able to glom onto a bunch of different information security projects, learn a lot about information security. Had a passion for technology as well. So we had some turnover in the position, and what the organization was looking for at the time I applied for the position was someone who could drive better policy, right? Someone who could drive sort of the compliance side of information security and also understood the technology and was able to drive some of the technology development as well. I signed up. I pretty much said, "Hey, you're not going to do any worse than me, so like let's let's give it a try." And no, it was apparently a match made in heaven. I was there for 3 years in the CISO position. Went through a lot of really heavy audits. Was able to drive compliance more comprehensively through those. Leveraging both an understanding of technology and an understanding of the legal drivers behind why we had to do good security. And then at Mainline Health, have pretty much been doing the same, right? Driving the technology in order to meet our compliance objectives and to make sure that we're not running afoul of the law, right? Because I think, at least in recent years, healthcare has come under increasing attack. And a lot of what we do is to mitigate HIPAA problems, right? And preserve patient safety and patient dignity through doing that. Really a lot of what we do is legally driven, but at the same time, really does serve our patients well.
Gotcha. So you've definitely given me some thought about another string of questions, because I do want to talk about guardians of the grid, because as I said to you earlier before we got in the studio, finding the story and reading about it and then reading about you is really kind of what made me stalk you on LinkedIn. So thanks for taking that invitation on LinkedIn. So what was the time frame for you from when you first became a CISO until today? What's that span of time look like?
About 7 years ago.
Okay, so 7 years.
Yeah.
So
I
my
had to think about
follow-on,
it.
yeah, that's okay. So my
Sorry.
follow-on question now is, so if you take a look at the challenges that you were dealing with day in and day out 7 years ago, compared to those challenges, and realizing it's a different role, you're in a different organization, I understand, but challenges nevertheless. If you take a look at 7 years ago until today, how different are those challenges for a CISO today?
I want to say it's like night and day, but really it's a progression of a lot of the same stuff, right? So, the things I had to worry about 7 and, my predecessors 8, 9, 10 years ago at the same organization, a lot of banking Trojans, trying to steal passwords and exfiltrate those so someone could later come in and access someone's bank account or, get health benefits or food stamp benefits, SNAP benefits, excuse me. And nowadays it's really about causing as much harm to an organization as possible in order to extract the highest payment possible, right? So ransomware attacks, I want to say I read a figure, as of July, we had experienced as many ransomware attacks in healthcare as we had in 2022 or 2021, right?
Wow.
And we're likely going to see as many ransomware attacks this year as both years combined. So it's a staggering number of healthcare organizations and organizations just generally that are attacked. And I think threat actors are financially incentivized to wreak that kind of havoc.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that is the biggest change, right? So instead of fighting malware on the endpoint, we're now fighting pretty much infrastructure integrity across the board, right? And the endpoint's still important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And I feel like that is a pretty significant change over the past decade.
Gotcha. So now the question becomes, let's say that you have an opportunity to walk into any of those beautiful tall buildings in Philadelphia, regardless of who they may belong to. Some of the largest organizations, not only in Pennsylvania but in the United States, for that matter. And you get the opportunity as the subject matter expert, as a CISO, to walk into that boardroom, what is, if there is such a thing, what is that single piece of advice that people really need to pay attention to at the board level? Because I think that if you have a conversation with fellow CISOs or other folks within the IT profession, it may resonate differently with them. But when you walk in that room with board members, what's that piece of advice that you want to give them, and for them, you want them to really sit back and go, "Wow, Aaron, tell me more."
Be reasonable. I think that's sort of the advice in a nutshell, right? Given the volume and veracity of threats in the environment at large, I think a lot of organizations either aren't making the investments they need, or they're making investments in places that aren't necessarily going to mitigate threats. And given the volume of threats we're seeing, there's some anecdotal evidence, highlighting that, right? So I think, we don't want to break the bank on security. We also don't want to be in a position where we're not making intelligent strategic spends in security in order to improve that, right? So being reasonable in the space, I think, is critical. Understanding, where the threat actors are coming from and how to mitigate against those attacks is key, in my opinion.
Okay. Angie, I don't want to suck all the oxygen out of the studio. So do you have questions that you'd like to ask?
Wow. Thank you. Yes.
Well, you're sitting there quietly, which is unlike you. You're not a very quiet person. So I'll move the virtual mic over to that side of the studio.
Well, A, I don't want to interrupt you because that is a big no-no. B, I've been furiously writing questions for Aaron.
Uh-oh.
By the way, she's looking for a job, Aaron. So give any tips you can give her on her resume would be appreciated.
Yeah, you got it.
Aaron, I mean, I'm just so fascinated with you because your background, to me, having taught courses for the Pennsylvania Bar Institute, having been in the trenches with clients on incident response in healthcare for 15 years now, like, you're the dream CISO. You have a law degree, you're a lawyer. So you're not coming at this just from the technician standpoint. I have to believe that, some of the challenges that we see in client environments where people drag their heels, IT departments know that they need significant investment, but they're not getting it because they don't speak the language of business, or they don't speak the language of risk management. Like, I have to believe that you're able to just beat those walls down right away because you come at it with a background and such a heavy legitimacy by virtue of being an attorney. Would I be wrong in making that assumption about you?
Well, first, thank you very much for saying so. I really appreciate the compliment. But no, I think I've been largely successful in driving solid risk conversations in my career. I hope it's for the reasons that you identified, right? Being able to have those risk-based, business-based conversations and being savvy to that. I think, when you get too technical about these things, like, eyes just glaze over and, nobody wants to hear it. Right. So, and I think a lot of people in technology and, myself included, do get into, sort of diving deep into things that we probably shouldn't. Right. And resorting to certain scare tactics that I think aren't really effective. So I think it is key to be able to have those kinds of conversations and do it intelligently.
Yeah, yeah. And, one of the things that we do in our tabletop exercises, and one of the things that's so interesting to me about Guardians of the Grid is, the gamification of something that really is challenging, constantly evolves, constantly changes. And, oftentimes clients, when they have us do tabletop exercises with them, sometimes they're driving the conversation in a way where, let's say, they want to make sure that they're putting their best foot forward to their boss, not necessarily the way that they're going to respond to an incident. So in terms of playing Guardians of the Grid, this board game incident response, how does your game handle those situations of, throwing in that monkey wrench of the unknown, or, that twist that all of us that work in incident response know that what it appears at first blush is rarely what it ultimately ends up being? Talk to me about how your game mirrors that reality of incident response.
Yeah, and so it's based on the cards that someone has, right? So the gameplay mechanics are fairly simple, and I do that intentionally because the focus should be on, hey, what is the crisis happening, unfolding on the table in front of us, and what exactly do all these things mean, right? So 2 players, 10 players, however many players you want, face off against each other. And really it's sort of a tit for tat type situation, right? So one side of the board goes first, the other side then responds, and you continue from there, trying to either defend against an attack or implement an attack. Excuse me. And the game highlights different attack pathways, from the CIS top 10, or OWASP top 10, excuse me, from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, et cetera. And, also leverages industry standard sort of best practice frameworks to defend, like, again, MITRE ATT&CK framework or the NIST cybersecurity framework, et cetera. And by highlighting the things on both sides, you're able to throw a monkey wrench into a different player's plan. So, for example, you might play an existential crisis card, right? Which has 10 points and, is able to move you significantly across the board. Another player may be able to thwart that entirely by playing, sort of what I'd call a bonus card, right? Where you're able to effectively halt all movement from the other player or move them backwards even in their preparation. So, I think by having that sort of tit for tat, you're able to simulate some of the exigency of the situation, some of the surprise of the situation, but also meaningfully learn about these industry standard frameworks or, attack pathways.
So that begs a couple questions. We have clients that are at all stages of incident response cybersecurity maturity, from
Right.
they have no incident response plan. And excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. No incident response plan, to then those clients that not only do they have an incident response plan that we help them create, but they have year after year been tabletopping it, improving it as they're going, adapting, adjusting, very mature. So is your card game best suited for one end or the other of the spectrum of these folks?
I don't think I think it's probably better suited for less mature security departments from hey, we need to put something in place. I think for more mature, security departments, it's probably more of a novelty, right? Like, hey, we're going to play through a board game for this, but I mean, really, they have their act together, so they don't need a whole lot of help in the space. For less sophisticated security programs, I think they probably have a security director, or maybe they don't. Maybe it's just an IT director who also has the mantle of dealing with information security. And really, then it's okay, how do we communicate and make tangible these threats, and also how you might mitigate against these threats? So I think it really highlights for those kinds of organizations what they may want to do in this space, or in fact, what they may not want to do in the space.
Yeah, and I know you're on Kickstarter and you're in early stage. So if I'm asking questions about anything that, is to come in future card packs or things like this, I mean, just taking a look at the Kickstarter page, and I'm dying to play this, quite frankly. And I have a couple other thoughts. Like, I mean, I would love to, and Joe knows I'm always throwing stuff at him, putting him on the spot. But I'd love to see a Reclamier branded that we could play with our clients card pack. But it kind of reminds me of Catan a little bit, where there are different packs that you can play. One of the things that I see our clients needing is they need the business aspects, the business impacts of what happens with these different types of attacks that you're portraying under the MITRE framework. So, for instance, the technical response, yes, that's one thing, and you know, you're going to attack and then have counter moves on that, on the technical response. But things like the accounting system is breached, not allowing us to print paychecks or not allowing us to do direct deposit to our employees. Do you have game packs, or do you have different scenarios like that that are part of the game so that folks from finance, HR, legal counsel, PR, so that all of those folks can play? Or is it mainly right now just geared to the technical folks and making sure that they're kind of learning through gameplay the technical responses?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. We don't have boosters yet. We will be coming out with them at some point. So for now, the game goes through the entire NIST 861 incident response lifecycle, right? From preparation to the actual attack, to then remediation and response, and then recovery. And the first half of that, right? So when we look at the preparation and the attack, very highly technical. We're looking at, you know, threat actors potentially breaching an infrastructure, and then, you know, the defenders, right, the blue team, setting up the infrastructure needed to safeguard against that. In the latter parts of the effort, where we're looking at recovery, and then we're looking at business continuity effectively. Sorry, I'm like tongue twisted with that. You know, those are largely administrative, right? So those are less about the technology and more about, hey, we can't pay our employees. We're going to have social media leaks. We're going to get bad press. You know, we leaked patient data, and now, you know, patient dignity is compromised. Like a lot of those things that a lot of technologists maybe not think about, and a lot of businesses might not think about as well. But, you know, are, as you identified, absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Aaron, let me, if I could,
let me, Joe, I need to ask one more question. I have to ask one more question.
Okay,
Really quickly.
don't have an entire dissertation before you get to your question, though. That's the only thing I would say.
Okay. Here's what I'm dying to ask Aaron. Aaron, I believe that healthcare incident response is the most challenging because of the HIPAA security rule having the presumption of breach until it's proven otherwise. Other industries don't have that. And so how does your game handle that? And can you speak a little bit to that in what you see in actual real life practical implications of that kind of presumption of guilt during a security incident in healthcare?
Yeah. So, I mean, the game takes the approach that, you know, you've been breached, right? And you're recovering from the breach. So we sort of, you know, if we're talking about guilt, like the breach has happened, and we understand that it's worst case scenario. And frankly, when you exercise on it, you really do have to approach it from that worst case scenario standpoint, because, you know, whatever actually happens in real life isn't going to be that worst case scenario, because you're preparing, because you're exercising, because you're building the infrastructure around it, right? Because you're being reasonable about ransomware response. It's the organizations, I think, that don't take those measures, where in real life, worst case scenario hits, right? You know, they're hospital down for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, right? You know, completely, and, you know, not recovered for months after that. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of patient records leaked, right? You know, so I think I don't like that sort of presumption of guilt, but I think it helps drive really good compliance efforts and really reasonable compliance efforts. Because as long as you're reasonable, I think HIPAA, it doesn't excuse it, but it's a lot lighter, right? So, you know, at least the consequences of that. And yeah.
You hope it is.
Exactly, right?
So definitely a cool career path.
Thank you.
I think Angie would agree. We don't find many attorneys that want to jump into information security. And
There's
more
dozens of us.
Are there really? Okay, that's cool. That's a good thing to know, right? But I guess now the bigger question, to really kind of bring it full circle, is where does something like Guardians of the Grid come from? Like, how does that happen for you?
Yeah, and so I think I mentioned I do a lot of tabletop exercises internal to our organization, and with other organizations as well. And they tend to be pretty boring affairs where you sit down and you say, okay, here's X, here's Y. How do you respond to this? How do you respond to that? And they get very technical and in unexpected ways where the technology plays a big role in the entire incident response lifecycle. But if you're sitting down with a bunch of clinicians, for example, having a conversation about how they'd continue care, they really don't want to talk about the technology, but it's sort of important to have a little bit of that understanding. So the thought behind Guardians of the Grid is, okay, clearly as an industry, we're facing a crisis, right? There aren't enough staff, there aren't enough people really taking cybersecurity seriously in a way that's driving meaningful change across industry. So the idea is, okay, let's make this fun, right? Let's get people engaged in cybersecurity in a way that they haven't been before. Let's not focus on the technology. Let's not necessarily focus on the impacts. Let's focus on the entire incident life cycle so that we can say, okay, for those people who aren't technical at all, here are the potential technical reasons why this is going to happen at a very high level. And for those people who are very technical, say, okay, here's what happens to your organization as a result of this breach, right? So sort of bridging the functions of technology and operations and really trying to get engagement that way.
So it's interesting because as an entrepreneur, specifically in the framework of the entrepreneurial mindset, you were able to, from direct experience, identify the opportunity, which was not so much about the technology, infrastructure, et cetera, but there was a part of your conversation where you recognize that the problem is that the industry as a whole doesn't have enough staff, okay? And that if we're not going to have enough staff, we have to make sure that those that we do have are fully engaged. And in order for them to be fully engaged, we've got to make this a little bit more fun. That progression is really important to recognize, because other men and women that may watch this often will sit back as potential entrepreneurs, wondering, how do I find that opportunity? How do I spin up that idea? And it comes down to, what do you experience and recognize, number one, as a perceived problem, and then when you bridge that to what you believe that possible solution looks like. So it's interesting to hear you walk through that, because we look at that with entrepreneurs all the time, whether they're in high school, whether they're doing a side hustle, or quite frankly, for those men and women that are in jail, believe it or not. I mean, it's interesting how they make that recognition come about. So,
well, and you put that a lot more eloquently than I did. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm just a pretty face that Angie hired because I do videos. That's really about my value. But thank you. So I guess really now, so what do you, over the course of the next, let's call it 12 months, what do you foresee happening with Guardians of the Grid? Like, where is this thing going to evolve to, grow to, et cetera, from your perspective?
That's a really good question. I sort of, for the past year, I really thought about, hey, let's build this game and get it out there, and really didn't look further than that, other than, like, we could turn it into a video game. We could make, sort of booster packs, etc. So what I'm really evaluating over the next 12 months is where do we go from here, right? And, I outlined some of that on the Kickstarter. Obviously, booster packs in my mind are a must. And I do want to make the gameplay with those a little more complex, right? So how do we shift the gameplay in a way where, okay, we have this very simple, straightforward exercise for tabletop, get people thinking about security. How do we then take that to the next level where we start helping people prepare more robustly for a potential attack, what that looks like, how to handle it, etc. And I'm a big video game nerd, right? So, obviously turning it into a video game would be fantastic. How I do that, I have no idea, right? I'm still trying to figure that out. But personal interest of mine.
Well, I definitely think that, what Angie shared in the very beginning, I'd strongly encourage you to, either reach back out to Angie or to Ben Franklin Technology Partners overall, because I think that you've got a really, you've got an interesting idea.
Thank you.
And I think that there's an incredible amount of practical application to it. And I would really hope that you don't get that. Don't let stuff get in your way of getting further down the runway, right? Because there's definitely some value. Whether you decide that you want to spin it up as a full-time gig that evolves from a side hustle, and say sayonara to your full-time job, I have no idea. Based on the fact that you told me you have kiddos at home, maybe that's not a reality, right? Don't make your significant other angry.
Yeah.
But it's something that, and I think Angie would agree. There's legs to this thing. Obviously, being able to flesh
Thank
that
you.
out, especially when everybody's got one of these little funky things,
Right.
and so when you can do that, I think again, it's that whole idea of making the problem not a drag to deal with, but you engage people, you make it interesting. Now it's kind of fun. And we know adult learners don't like to deal with a drag. It's got to be somewhat fun. And if you can make it competitive, where people are earning points, et cetera, I just think that there's definitely something to it. What do you, in your own career path, if this is appropriate to ask, what do you see yourself, over the next several years, really wanting to accomplish in your own career path besides Guardians of the Grid?
Yeah, so I'm in what I'd call and have called numerous times a unicorn job, right? Where I'm able to practice good cybersecurity, have really great partnerships across the organization, have executive leadership that have completely bought into the need for good security. So a lot of the conversations we talked about previously have already happened at the organization. And fortunately, I think everybody's been very receptive of that. So, I definitely want to continue building some of the partnerships I have currently and the security practice that I'm doing currently, right? I think Mainline Health is a great organization. Really love working there, really love being, head of security there, and really figuring out, okay, what are we going to do to further safeguard the organization? I'm also interested in a lot of the developing technology and security, right? And trying to figure out more about, what the impacts, AI is sort of a buzzword, right? But what the impacts of AI are going to have for security moving forward, right? Both from an attack threat standpoint and from a defense standpoint as well, right? So, I think diving deeper into that is going to be pretty interesting, and it is going to be a game changer, for security. Yeah, I can't really think otherwise. It's like one of those job interview questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And it's like, well,
Well, you know what? I think
yeah,
when you explained your career path, you talked about what you do today, and you talked about Guardians of the Grid. There's a tone in your voice that, I sense that there's a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment, and that's a big deal, right? Because there's a lot of people,
yeah,
unfortunately, that are in our industry it is just drudgery, and the fact that that's not an experience of yours on a regular basis, I think that's a really positive thing.
yeah.
Um,
Thank you. One
Angie,
thing I do want to highlight,
sure,
actually,
please.
if I apologize, I didn't want to talk over you, but one of the things we are doing with Guardians of the Grid, it is supporting a nonprofit that published the game, right, the game as well, called Pro Se Practice. And the idea behind Pro Se Practice is to educate folks to be able to exercise their rights, right? And that's sort of a very broad, statement, but the idea is, at least more broadly, and one of the things I saw practicing law is a lot of people are scared about, like, what happens, right? When they need to exercise their rights, when there is a legal issue, stuff like that, right? There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Same with cybersecurity, right? When it comes to highly technical matters, like that. And the overarching idea of the nonprofit is to provide that education. We started with cybersecurity and technology, but also looking to policy education as well, so that people are less fearful when they approach issues like this, and are able to better cope with what they're doing, right? So effectively taking what we're doing at the organizational level and bring it to the individual level.
So if someone, and I can't imagine that they wouldn't want to, if someone wants to purchase one of these board games, how do they do that?
So the Kickstarter, I believe, is going to complete in the next couple of days. So, go out to the Kickstarter. Otherwise, my website, prosepractice.org, we have a store set up there where people can purchase a copy of the board game there as well.
Okay, very cool. Angie, any last minute questions before we give Aaron back his morning?
Not really questions, Aaron, but just a couple areas for future consideration that as being in the trenches helping clients. Um, the first issue is that because of CSI, everybody thinks that it's easy to figure out whether or not an actual breach occurred.
Yeah.
And one of the things I see clients not prepared for is that ambiguity at the beginning. And because of that presumption of breach, um, that is so challenging. And oftentimes, and especially now with the cloud, it is very hard to get from vendors the evidence that you may need to be able to prove that you did not have a breach. So that's one scenario. The other scenario is that your organization decides not to report. However, you have a staff member that believes that, yes, you did breach the information, and they decide to be a whistleblower and reach out to OCR. And then the third scenario is also the place I see clients really challenged is, okay, we had a breach of more than 500 records. We're going to report it to OCR as we have to. What's the audit going to look like? I mean, healthcare breaches go on for a very long time because that follow-on action, regulatory enforcement, is something that I see clients really, really, really challenged with. And so from a risk management compliance perspective, those are some scenarios that I would love to be able to challenge folks to in a game like this as well. But I'm super excited about what you're doing. I think it is the coolest thing. And I can't wait to play it. I really can't.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Aaron, we obviously have pelted you with lots of questions. I don't know if you had any questions for Angie and I that you wanted to ask us.
Oh, geez, put you guys on the hot seat.
Our first.
Yeah, no, I mean, Angie, you were talking just now about the perils of sort of digital forensics and cloud integrity. I'm wondering, as you work out in the industry, right, and you talk to different clients, what exactly have you seen run the gamut of some of the most critical issues that they have in those areas? Because to your point, I think those are absolutely critical, both for being able to develop a presumption of innocence and also to understand what's going on.
Those three are the biggest ones, Aaron, quite frankly. What we find so often is that the folks in IT after a security incident are never in 23 years in working in this industry, 15 of which being directly in incident response, about a decade being in digital forensics. Never once have the IT people sat back and said, wow, we didn't think this was going to happen. It's the exact opposite. It is almost always the IT folks sitting back going, we knew this was just a matter of time. We've been asking for budget and support to solve this problem that was the root cause for forever, and nobody would give us what we needed. That is almost always the response that we see from the IT folks. So the technical response, most folks, and especially with the help of their cyber liability carriers, get the support they need on the technical response side. But that initial, do we even have a breach or don't we? And then that subsequent issue around the regulatory impact and what's going to happen when OCR comes in and does an audit, that all of that, man, they really struggle. And it is hard to help with that. Because CSI, you do not in 41 minutes figure out whether or not definitively you've had a breach. And, just like the IRS doing a tax audit, you have no idea what one auditor to the next, what one administration, and the impact that administration is going to have on the Department of Justice and how they enforce all of those wild cards. I mean, I wish we could give clients some kind of, feel good, boost when they're going through it. But it is a long, hard slog. And no matter how we frame it, it is always a challenge for Joe and I to convey to them that, the cost of cybersecurity in breach prevention is cheap compared to what it is going to cost you when it actually happens. And it most definitely is when, for every single organization across the board, as you well know.
Yeah. Yeah. I read another statistic. I think 99% of all organizations last year were impacted by ransomware in some way, shape, or form. So it's everywhere, right? I mean, it's ubiquitous. It's almost foolish not to do anything about it at this point. I will say CSI, also the devil for many industries. Years ago, I remember criminal lawyers griping about CSI because it set up this presumption that the police were super effective at forensics. And, if the forensics weren't there, or you had circumstantial evidence, like, the jury wouldn't buy it. Right. So, multiple different industries that CSI has just completely ruined.
Yeah. But I've also heard the other take, which is, you know what? There are people in college right now studying all sorts of forensic science that would not have ever dreamed of those types of careers were it not for that show. So I think for all of the negative impact that it's had across the board for many professionals, there is the hope that it is driving a whole new generation of folks to want to pursue careers, because we are so woefully underprepared for the professional levels of staffing that we need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Aaron Wisemann of Guardians of the Grid, again, thank you so much, man. This was really cool, and I can't thank you enough. I'll follow up with you when this is over. We have a super duper gift we're going to send you because you were crazy enough to agree to do this.
Oh, thank you.
I will have to give in and let Angie buy one of these board games to see how cool it really is. And I really hope that when she and I are in the Philadelphia region, hopefully we can connect in person and just chat over coffee or lunch.
Absolutely. And thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm going to close this
Thanks,
out of
Aaron.
the studio and then we can drop. Take care, Aaron.
You too.